This is the third lecture on the topic of adolescent. And let me get all queued up here. I'm sorry, I didn't get prepared for this before. And get the PowerPoints. So in the last video lecture, I was talking about how the brain develops from the back to the front. And I was talking briefly, or discussed a little bit about some of the physical eating disorders, number one causes, and how body image changes. In this lecture, I want to talk about sexuality, maybe a little bit about cognition, and we'll see how much time I've used up at that point. Okay, so this slide is just some terms relevant to or related to sexuality and sexual identity and orientation. Hopefully you've been introduced to these concepts in other classes or in other chapters, but I will just go over them here again, because remember, this is the time adolescence begins at the onset of puberty, which is the development is when your sexual structures develop up till adulthood. So this is a really sexualized time. A couple terms that I want to make sure you understand the difference is the difference between sexual orientation and sexual identity. I always talk about orientation as like the direction of your attraction. What direction are you oriented? Is your attraction oriented? What kind of thing, people, characteristics make you look twice, right? That would be your orientation. Your orientation need not have anything to do with what you actually do. For most people, their attraction is oriented towards who they actually have sex with, but they don't have to. They're two different parts of your identity. And your sexual identity then refers to your biological structure, which is also different than your gender identity. So all of these things are different aspects of the self. One question that people often talk about is, where does this come from? Is it biological or social? In the social science world that I exhibit, it doesn't matter to me where it comes from, because these are just different parts of the human condition. What is significant for this chapter is that this is during adolescence is when we're supposed to be experimenting, but our culture really doesn't give adolescents many opportunities to experiment with sexuality, or at least the ones that we do have are often stigmatized, or they're talked about in secret. But that's what's supposed to be happening, right? This period of adolescence. I was just reminded not very long ago about how adolescence is really the best time to experiment, because I'm not sexual experiment, but the best time to try new things, because this is the only time of life really that you're going to have this kind of the opportunities that come with physical well-being, the opportunities that come with not having responsibilities, and the opportunities that you're still attached to a family group that can support you. So really, this is the time to try out things, because later on you're going to have too many other responses. There's going to be too much to risk, quite frankly. So then you got some statistics in here about sexual activity. I don't know how it compares to the current textbook. A couple things that have consistently been true is that the more a young person knows about sexuality probably influences their earlier onset. So if they grow up in a home where sex is something that's not considered taboo, they have sex knowledge, they probably will have sex sooner than if they grow up in a house where it's all taboo and secret and nobody talks about it, or it's highly shamed. But the difference is that they will be safer. So it may be true that someone with more knowledge will have sex at a younger age, but it's also true that they're more likely to use protection. They're more likely to know what consent is. They're more likely to, they're going to be safer because they have information, right? So somewhere in here, right here, to Virginity Pledges, back in I guess it was the 90s or the early 2000s, this was sort of the rage in the secondary virginity thing, where communities of people, young people, would make commitments to each other to remain virgins until marriage. And what the research suggested is that they didn't. And those who took these pledges We're also less likely to use contraception, less likely to use safe sex practices like condoms and consent. And so, in fact, they put themselves at greater risk. So in this case, it's sort of like knowledge is power. And in the state of Kansas, at least, what students are getting in high schools is not as extensive as it has been before. In the state of Kansas, a teacher can not only be fired, but can be criminally prosecuted for sharing information with their students that the students deem as offensive or the parents deem as offensive. So it's a really risky kind of topic for Kansas public school teachers to get involved in. Then you got some lists on here. Oh, this is a great exam question. I don't know if I ask it in this chapter, in this class, or in another class. Who is more likely to get sexually transmitted infections from whom? And despite the sort of common myth that boys get it from girls, in fact, the answer is girls get sexually transmitted infections from boys, right? 1 in 3 girls from boys. And that has to do with the anatomy, that the women's and girls' anatomy is structured so that it's easier for them to get an infection from men's anatomy. Men are more likely to be asymptomatic, not to show any symptoms, right? So girls are more likely to get infections from boys. 1 in 3, it's very common. It's very common, but because it's also stigmatized, we don't talk about it as much, right? Here's a list of some of the more common ones. Many of these they can be bacterial or they can be viral. The viral ones, though, you ain't going to get rid of, like herpes and HPV. We used to call them genital warts, and HIV. Once you got those, you got them, right? They don't go away. And what's it say down here? Teen pregnancy, something on the order of about half of teenagers that become pregnant will do so within the first 6 months of becoming sexually active. And this may very well be because we're not making wise choices. We're not talking about it. We're not protecting ourselves, right? Okay, let's move on. Oh, I only got 3 minutes of this 10 minutes left. So these next couple slides are really about how the brain, how we think different. Remember cognitive? What does cognitive mean? That was just on their midterm. Cognitive is all about thinking, the way that our brain works for us to think. So effectively what happens when we're an adolescent is we begin to think differently than we did as children. And it happens quite quickly. So one of the concepts here is we go from formal operations to abstract operations. In other words, where in math class we might have learned 1 + 1 = 2, in middle school and adolescence we begin to comprehend the idea of negative numbers and positive numbers. Things become, we can imagine, we can understand concepts that we can't see, we can't touch. Right? This is also the time where we begin to question our parents. Once upon a time, when our under lesser developed cognitive, we just believed what our parents said because our parents were our parents. In adolescence, we begin to say, who are these people telling us what to do, right? And so we begin to question and argue and well, it all depends, right? Matter of perspective kind of thing. And what are some of the other things? So our brain is developing very quickly. We are going to maximize our brain power in about 10 to 12 years. So we have this uptick, if you will, of cognitive processes. Young people are learning things very quickly, right? Their brain is processing faster. They can hold more in working memory than other people. And I would argue that you're not going to notice the decline. So I can still remember being in graduate school. Of course, I was 25 in graduate school, but thinking how easy it was to learn stuff. And it took a good 10, 15 years away from that before I began to say, oh, I'm not learning stuff as quickly as I used to. So the adults, the grown-ups in your life, so to speak, are going to notice that, wow, you're just picking up stuff fast. And whereas we talk about in psychology that you have to learn things, like 7 times, in middle school, you're not needing to hear them 7 times. You're learning stuff quickly right away. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here with cognitive, and in the next one, we'll talk about self. I'll talk about some egocentrism and other concepts like that.